Shalom, everybody. Rabbi Edelstein here. It's been a few weeks since I've been here, but this is an official installment of Rabbi E in 3D, coming to you live last minute before Shabbos. And it's a cold day, so please come into the warm drawing room / library, and we will share. We'll be warmed together by words of wisdom that come from the Torah. This week's Torah portion by Yigash, the second to last portion in the book of Genesis or Bereshis. I really only want to bring out one main point in our very short time together, and that is that we are in perpetual danger in our lives of misjudging people, their motivations, and also misjudging situations. Hey, and that rhymed. I didn't even think that would. Misjudging people and their motivations and lots of situations. Okay. I'm not going to continue the poem. Where do we see that? We see that in a most remarkable, dramatic moment that's the climax of a long story that's been building an extended narrative, one of the most memorable in the whole Torah for the last 2 weeks, starting in Parshas Vayeshev, then Miketz, then Vayigash, the narrative of Joseph and his brothers, Yosef and his brothers. And really, I can't do justice to the story by summarizing it. You got to read it. Incredible. But basically, the climax and the aftermath are in this week's portion of Vayigash. And again, the lesson I want to bring out in our short time together in our warm room together on a cold day together, warmed by wisdom from the Torah, is the danger of misjudging people and their motivations and situations. And we do that in life. And Joseph's brothers are made aware of that in the dramatic moment that I'm going to discuss with you right now. And that is when Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. And this is 22 years after they have sold him into slavery down to Egypt, or he's sold and then he's brought down to Egypt. They wanted to get him out of their lives. They thought he was a menace to the family, to the future Jewish people. They thought he was evil, no less than that, evil. And they sold him, and then we know the story of Joseph is even he goes through trials and tribulations that are unbelievable, temptations that we can't begin to imagine how he withstood them as a 17-year-old. I'm speaking, of course, of the seduction attempt, multiple seduction attempts by his master's wife, Potiphar. But Joseph rises up to the top in Potiphar's house. He's thrown into a dungeon then for being accused of assaulting Potiphar's wife when he didn't do that. But that's Joseph's story. He goes through trials and tribulations. But now, when the brothers 22 years later are facing Joseph, who is Joseph? He's been elevated to second in command in Egypt after having interpreted Pharaoh's dreams in a marvelous way and having prophesied really that there'd be 7 years of plenty in Egypt, followed by 7 years of famine. And it's after a couple of years of that famine that brings down the brothers from the land of Canaan to Egypt. And they're in front of Joseph, whom they don't recognize. That's actually in last week's Torah portion. And Joseph puts them through a spiritual tribulation of their own, for the ultimate purpose, Ramban and other great commentators say, of rectifying their previous sin that they had committed against him. And that's not our topic now, so I'm sorry, you got to read the narrative to see. But the moment now when Joseph reveals himself and he says, I am Joseph. I'm Joseph, your brother, who you sold down to Egypt. And those two sentences, separate verses, they had misjudged him to the ultimate sense. They thought he was the destroyer of the family, and indeed he was the one meant to preserve the family in the years of famine. They thought he was not of high moral character, I'm sure they suspected of him that, and he showed them, they saw that he was righteous. They saw that, they perceived that. The rabbi saying, when he said, I am Joseph, your brother whom you sold to Egypt, he was conveying to them that I remained Joseph in all the years in Egypt, through all the trials and tribulations and unsavory environmental influences of Egypt, to a nice monotheistic, pious boy from the land of Canaan. I remain Joseph. I remained righteous. So they had misjudged him utterly, completely. They thought he was the destroyer. He was the savior of the family. They thought he wasn't fit for leadership. He was meant to be the leader of the brothers, and his righteousness endured through all those years in Egypt. It's actually, so it's well, I skipped over the beautiful, tearful moment of just reunification to skip to that. Well, from the point of view of the brothers, it was an overwhelming, awesome, and actually painful realization of how much they misjudged him. They misjudged their brother. Now, jumping from there to our own lives, okay, it's we'd be hard pressed to find perhaps I said situations as dramatically as such dramatic misjudgments, mischaracterizations, perhaps in our own lives, and maybe and definitely perhaps ones that are not so dramatic in import and world historical in in the trajectory of the events, maybe for most of us, right? But we can really be wrong about people. We can think people are ill-disposed to us, and it cannot be true. So again, we'll dial down perhaps the intensity of the context, but in our own lives, we have to be very careful about not misjudging people, giving people the benefit of the doubt, certainly not jumping to an extreme conclusion and then taking dramatic, I would say ill-fated. They weren't ill-fated steps by the brothers. They turned out to be part of Hashem's master plan, which will be the second and last point today. So they weren't ill-fated in that sense, but they were wrong from the brothers' point of view, dramatic and wrong and consequential actions based on their misjudgment of their brother and his motivations and his character. So we have to be very, very careful in our own lives. I think we'll spare ourselves. I'm talking to myself always, everybody, as I always do. I'll spare myself much suffering in the years ahead, and all of us will, when we just be skeptical about our quick judgments about people, about their motivations. Of course, it doesn't mean being naive, and sometimes people truly are ill-disposed towards us or whatever, but many times our own bias, our own clouded glasses or lenses can really mess us up. And certainly to take counsel with our deeper selves, with friends who have an objective point of view sometimes on people, judging people, and finally on judging situations. Now here, in what sense? Well, obviously, in the immediate framework of the story, the brothers thought they were being in some nightmarish plot that had been set up against them, and really it was just to bring them to a beautiful emotional reunification and understanding of the mistake they had made 22 years before, that they actually showed themselves, Yehuda especially, they weren't going to make again. But again, I'm leaving out all the details that you have to check out on your own in this wonderful Shabbat. Cold day, probably tomorrow, at least in these part of the country. So take out your chumash and warm yourself with a nice cup of coffee or cocoa or preferred drink and learn the beautiful story of Joseph. Anyway, the brothers, I'm sorry, I digress. That's the danger of the live feed. The live feed, I like it because it's fun and spontaneous, but it also tends to, meander. Okay, but anyway, the brothers misjudged Joseph's character. Joseph himself was thrown into literally a pit more than once, a pit by the brothers, and then sold down to Egypt, falsely accused of trying to assault his master's wife and thrown into a pit, a dungeon in Egypt. So Joseph's always being thrown into pits, and he seems to rise out of them. And it's not just because he has a positive attitude, which I'm sure he did. The rabbis actually say that the name of Hashem was always on his lips. And what that means is that he, I think we can read between the lines and infer, though the Torah doesn't say it explicitly, he didn't misjudge situations. Meaning, the ultimate way he could have misjudged his life, then the events of his life, was to say, this is the ultimate worst thing that could ever have happened to me. This is nightmarish. And did he ever have such a thought? Perhaps. But right now, 22 years later, he says to his brothers, he sums up his view now of the situation, which I think we can infer was really all along part of his greatness of character, his greatness of perspective, that he intuited, actually more than that, he was given a dream, and he realized, as did Yaakov, his father, really, that those dreams were not just idle fantasies, but were true prophetic foretellings of what would happen. So my point is that during the difficult times that Joseph experienced, he didn't misjudge the situation. Was it pleasant? Obviously not. We can't even believe how unpleasant it must have been. But he says now, 22 years later, it was not you who sent me here, he says to his brothers, but Hashem. He sent me here to preserve our family in the famine. And then in the bigger picture, also, we see that Joseph being there was the preparation for Jacob coming down to Egypt and the preparation for the whole family being brought into the land of Egypt, which was part of Hashem's plan prophesied already to Abraham hundreds of years before, or not before, earlier. So the point is how easy it would have been for Joseph to misjudge everything that he was going through in Egypt and say it was the worst possible thing, the disaster, the end of everything. But yet he didn't live with that message, with that self-communication. Quite the opposite, surely, that Hashem has a plan, and it was to make him in some way or other the ruler, like the original dream he had suggested. And now it comes true 22 years later, and he reassures the brother, not taking vengeance against them, saying to them, no, it wasn't you ultimately who did this. It was Hashem's plan. So to summarize and to let you go, and I want to switch over to a different screen now because Shabbos is coming. But with those warm words from our Torah, easy to say, hard to live, easy to read the story and be moved by the story, which we all should be, harder to internalize those lessons, but that's what Torah is for. It's instructions for life, not to misjudge people, to be careful of how we label people, their motivations, what they're really about. Caution is often in order, but not making dramatic decisions and taking dramatic actions based on them that could have unforeseen and difficult consequences, like for the brothers, and not misjudging situations, whether it's this national crisis that all of us are going through. It's not good. It's not fun. It's not good from our point of view, but what can we say? It's a Jewish view that it's all ultimately for the best, that all ultimately will bring about great things in the world. And why it has to be this way, that's not why the Jewish people had to go through the difficulties in Egypt, which will be in the next book of the Torah, the book of Exodus, why it had to be that way in order to come out at the other end as a chosen people standing at Mount Sinai. That we can't answer, but that it was a bigger plan, a bigger picture, ultimately for a benefit in a universal sense, that we can say. And again, if it's too hard, and for everyone, myself very much included, hard to maintain such a perspective in the bigger things, and certainly in the smaller things in our life, the setbacks, the obstacles. I didn't get this job. I didn't, this didn't work out exactly how I wanted. Oh, it's a disaster. It's horrible. That's how I judge it. No, don't do that. You might be dramatically misjudging it. And the darkest times are meant ultimately to be, for us, the cause of shining an inner light, turning to the light of the Torah and our spiritual strength. So through the darkness, we can find light, the greatest light. And don't misjudge people, don't misjudge situations. Don't misjudge Rabbi Ian 3 when he says it's Rabbi Ian 3, because it usually goes a little longer. But have a wonderful Shabbos, and it was nice spending a few minutes for you. Enjoy Shabbos. It's a time to step back and maybe think about the past week. It should a time to think about the past week in maybe ways we misjudged situations. They were really opportunities and we didn't see them that way, or people in our interactions with them, how we perhaps didn't judge favorably as much as we could. Have a great Shabbos. Thank you so much for listening. Stay warm. And it's hard for Jews to say goodbye, right? We all know that. So that's true. Bye-bye.